Last night, 3 cargoes of tea were emptied into the sea. This morning, a man-of-war sails. This is the most magnificent movement of all.
That's quite a statement.
It is, he continues. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the Patriots that I greatly admire.
And that's John Adams writing in his diary.
The very next day, December 17th, 1773, he finishes with this. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, and it must have some important consequences, that I can't but consider it as an epoch in history.
An epoch in history. He absolutely nailed it. That phrase captures the very escalation we're looking at today. It's the moment when this long-simmering ideological resistance finally crosses a line.
A line into physical, violent action, and importantly, the destruction of private property.
Exactly.
So we're focusing on those critical years between the Tea Party and the outbreak of actual fighting. Before this, the colonists, especially in Boston, they'd been pushing back against British trade regulations, mostly through boycotts.
Coordinated boycotts, which were very effective. And we should remember, the British government had already repealed most of the Townsend duties, those taxes on glass, paper, things like that.
But they left one.
They left one, the duty on tea. Parliament kept that tax, not really for the revenue, which was minimal, but to maintain the principle.
The principle of parliamentary supremacy.
That's it. And that one single symbolic tax, which, by the way, passed in Parliament by a majority of just one vote, it set the stage for this whole confrontation. Without it, none of what followed would have unfolded in the same way.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this podcast is to analyze the key events, the legislation, the shifting ideas from that Tea Act in 1773, right up to the first shots of the war.
And to explain how Britain's attempts to assert its own sovereignty actually ended up unifying the colonies against it.
It seems first we need to understand the Tea Act itself.
Right, and it's so critical to establish the context for the Tea Act of 1773. History tells us that this act wasn't really about America, not primarily.
It wasn't designed to punish them.
No, not at all. It was, first and foremost, a piece of domestic policy. It was designed to solve a massive financial crisis that was engulfing the East India Company.
The EIC. Now, this was far more than just a trading company, wasn't it? It was this immense entity, so tied to the state that, looking back, we can see the origins of the idea of too big to fail.
That's the perfect modern analogy. The EIC basically had sovereign powers in India. It ran its own army, a massive army. It administered huge territories, collected taxes. It governed large held stock in the company. So when the EIC got into trouble around 1772, it was a national crisis.
And what was causing the distress?
A combination of things: mismanagement, corruption, falling revenues, and a credit crisis made much, much worse by the devastating famine in Bengal, which had just wiped out its tax base in India.
And back in London, the most visible sign of this problem was tea.
A mountain of it. Millions and millions of pounds of tea just sitting in London warehouses, unsold. It was a huge financial liability. The government had to find a way to move it, and fast, to bail out this corporation that was so vital to the state.
So this brings us to the Tea Act.
Logistical standpoint, it was pretty ingenious.
How did it work exactly? The old system involved middlemen, right?
Right. Previously, the EIC had to sell its tea at a public auction in London. Also,
Colonial merchants.
a huge one. All those American merchants, whether they were legitimate traders or, frankly, smugglers dealing in cheaper Dutch tea, were suddenly cut out of the supply chain entirely.
And the new arrangement meant that the EIC tea, even with that old Townsend duty still attached, would actually be cheaper.
Often cheaper, yes. It could undercut both the legally imported tea that had gone through the London auction and the smuggled Dutch tea. The government's thinking was, well, threefold.
Okay.
First, offload the surplus and save the EIC. Second, undercut the smugglers and promote legal trade. And third, reinforce the Navigation Acts. They really thought they were offering a sweet deal.
Cheaper tea, what's not to like?
Exactly.
But the Americans did not see it as a benign or beneficial arrangement at all, did they? Despite the lower cost?
Not for a second. They immediately saw the direct sale arrangement as creating a monopoly, a de facto monopoly.
So even if the act didn't technically forbid other tea sales?
In practice, the EIC's ability to just flood the market with cheap tea, all managed through its own network of agents, would crush all competition. For independent American merchants, many of whom, like John Hancock, were leaders in the resistance, This was financial ruin.
But the real resistance, the core of it, it wasn't just commercial, was it? It became political, ideological. How did the leaders convince the average person who's now getting cheaper tea to care about the politics?
And that is the absolute key. This is what elevates the whole thing from a simple trade dispute into a constitutional crisis. The colonial leaders framed the act not as an economic benefit, but as a kind of insidious trap.
The trick.
Yes, the argument was Parliament is dangling this cheap tea in front of you, but if you buy it, if you accept it, you are tacitly accepting their right to tax you without your consent.
So it was another assertion of parliamentary sovereignty.
A very clear one. The colonists had been fighting this principle for a decade. By passing the Tea Act and keeping that duty, Parliament was, once again, trying to settle the matter for good. They had ultimate authority. And even cheap tea, if it came with that string attached, was an unacceptable symbol of subjugation.
They were willing to sacrifice the economic gain to protect the political principle.
They were. And that political principle, of course, brings us right back to the heart of the whole American resistance.
Their understanding of English liberties.
And that famous slogan, no taxation without representation. This wasn't just a catchphrase. For them, it was a deeply held constitutional belief.
And when we say English liberties, we're talking about a political tradition they saw as stretching back centuries.
Oh, absolutely. The colonists saw themselves as Englishmen, entitled to all the rights of Englishmen. They traced this lineage back through the Glorious Revolution, the English Civil War, all the way back to Magna Carta.
And central to that was the security of property.
The security of property and the idea of consent. No one, not the king, not Parliament, could take their property, either by force or through taxes, without the consent of their own representatives.
And since they had no representatives sitting in Westminster,
Parliament had no right to tax them, full stop. It was a very clear, logical argument from their perspective.
the British government, of course, had a counter-argument to this, the theory of virtual representation. Could you explain that premise? And why did it fail so completely to persuade the Americans?
Well, the premise was that a member of Parliament, once they were elected, didn't just represent their own local constituents. They represented the interests of all British subjects everywhere in the empire.
A unified body politic.
Exactly. And they point out that most working-class people in Britain couldn't vote either, but they were still considered virtually represented.
But the weakness of that argument in the American context seems obvious.
It was incredibly weak, because at least MPs in London were generally aware of the issues facing, say, Manchester or Cornwall. But what we find is that hardly any of the men sitting in the House of Commons had ever even been to America.
They were just too remote, too misunderstood by the governing class in London.
Completely. The colonists had a very strong case that their interests weren't just unrepresented, they were actively ignored. The specific needs of Virginia's tobacco economy or Massachusetts' shipping trade were foreign concepts to most MPs.
So the American claim that they were being governed arbitrarily, without knowledge or consent, it just gained more and more traction.
It did. And what's fascinating is that this constitutional argument actually found a lot of sympathy back in Britain, even within the political establishment.
You had figures who publicly broke with their own government over this.
Absolutely. People like Colonel Isaac Barré, who actually coined the term Sons of Liberty, and the great political thinker Edmund Burke, they were very vocal critics. And then you had radicals outside Parliament, like John Wilkes.
And they saw the colonial cause as something more than just a tax dispute.
They did. They saw the colonies as a kind of more purified version of the English Republican tradition.
What do you mean by that?
Well, these British dissidents worried that the values of the 1640s, the English Civil War era, things like limited government, civic virtue, they believed those values had been corrupted by the very aristocratic factional politics of 1770s England.
So they looked at America's more decentralized democratic culture.
And they saw an idea. They saw something pure, something that needed to be protected from the corruption of the mother country.
Given all this ideological ferment, were the colonists already talking about independence at this point, say by 1774?
You know, the research on this is very clear. Almost nobody was openly arguing for complete independence or for creating a republic before 1774, maybe even 75.
So they still felt a loyalty to the king.
A very real and fierce loyalty. They saw themselves as loyal subjects of King George III. They believed the crown of Great Britain was the freest in the world, and they were proud to be part of that system.
So their fight wasn't with the crown, it was with Parliament.
Precisely. The standard political move was to blame the king's evil advisors, or a corrupt parliament, for misleading him. They clung to this hope that if only the king knew the true situation, if the facts could just reach him, he would step in and protect their liberties from Westminster. That loyalism was a very powerful brake on radicalism.
Until the tea ships arrived.
Until the tea ships arrived. That's when this ideological debate turned into an immediate crisis of action. The clock started ticking the moment the first ship, the Dartmouth, sailed into Boston Harbor on November 28, 1773.
And there was a legal deadline, right?
A 20-day limit. The law said a ship could only stay in port for 20 days before its cargo had to be unloaded and became liable for duties. That put the final deadline on December 17th.
So those 20 days must have been incredibly tense.
A pressure cooker. There were constant mass meetings, first at Faneuil Hall, then they had to move to the larger Old South Meeting House because the crowds were huge, thousands of people. And the consensus from the very beginning was clear.
The tea must not be unloaded.
It could not land. Meanwhile, the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, he was a staunch loyalist, and he refused to issue a permit for the ships to leave the harbor without unloading the tea.
So he forces a standoff.
He does. He's determined to uphold the law and assert crown authority. So you have the governor refusing to let the ships leave and the people refusing to let the tea be unloaded. As that deadline approached, a violent confrontation became almost inevitable.
Which brings us to the night of December 16th. And this wasn't a spontaneous riot.
Far from it. It was highly organized. The participants, mostly Sons of Liberty, they planned it carefully. They even adopted disguises.
The famous Mohawk attire.
Yes, or just blackening their faces with soot. The disguise was symbolic. It was a way of rejecting their identity as regulated British subjects and adopting a new, freer, savage identity for the purpose of this act.
And their actions were very deliberate when it came to property damage.
Incredibly disciplined. They were careful not to damage the ships themselves. Their entire focus was on destroying the tea to prevent the duty from being paid. They ended up dumping 340 chests into the harbor.
Which was a huge amount of money.
About 10,000 pounds sterling worth of private property. It was a massive financial blow.
And that action, the destruction of valuable private property, that is the line that was crossed. It alienated a lot of people who had, until then, supported the resistance.
It's the crucial turning point. The entire argument of no taxation without representation was built on the principle of defending private property.
You can't take my property without my consent.
Exactly. So when the patriots themselves turn around and violently destroy property, even if it's politically tainted property, it compromises their co-position in the eyes of many moderates and conservatives.
And we see that rift immediately. Benjamin Franklin, who was in London at the time, he called the Tea Party an act of violent injustice.
He was horrified. For conservatives like Franklin, property was sacrosanct. This act risked replacing a high-minded constitutional debate with, mob rule and anarchy. It galvanized the Loyalists and, frankly, gave the British government the moral high ground it needed to retaliate with force.
And who were these revolutionary leaders, like Samuel Adams? Were they marginalized figures?
Not at all. They were overwhelmingly from the property classes. They were successful merchants, lawyers, landowners, the highly educated elite of their society.
So they were defending their own material interests.
They were, but we shouldn't be too cynical. They also sincerely believed that their inherited English liberties were being destroyed. These were not a disorganized rabble. They were the leaders of their communities who feared the loss of self-governance more than anything.
And the reaction in London to their actions was predictable.
It was shock, and it was pure righteous indignation. 10,000 pounds sterling. King George III and Lord North's government, they just could not let that stand. They saw it not as a protest, but as an act of criminal warfare.
And Lord North felt he had to react severely.
He felt he had no choice at all. He said the Americans were acting as if they were an independent empire. For him, this is the moment of truth. He said, "We are now to establish our authority or give it up entirely."
So the response was a series of punitive laws, known in Britain as the Coercive Acts.
And known to the Americans, fittingly, as the Intolerable Acts.
And the strategy was to isolate and punish Massachusetts, which London saw as the heart of the rebellion.
That was the plan. Isolate Boston, make an example of it, and the other colonies would fall into line.
Let's go through them. The first was the Boston Port Act.
A direct economic chokehold. The act closed the port of Boston to all trade, all traffic, until the destroyed tea was paid for in full.
The goal was to starve them into submission, but it backfired, didn't it?
It backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, it created a wave of continental sympathy. Supplies, food, money, it all started pouring into Boston from the other colonies. It actually catalyzed intercolonial cooperation.
So the second act was even more alarming politically. The Massachusetts Government Act.
This one struck right at the heart of their self-governance. It essentially tore up the Massachusetts Charter. It limited the town meetings, which were the lifeblood of their local democracy, to just once a year and only with the governor's permission.
And it changed how the government was structured.
It did. The governor's council, which had always been elected by the colonial assembly, was now to be appointed directly by the crown. It stripped away a huge part of their self-rule and put the colony under direct London control.
And that must have terrified the other colonies.
Of course, it proved that their own charters, their own foundational documents, were just pieces of parchment that Parliament could destroy at will. If it could happen to Massachusetts, it could happen to any of them.
And the third act, the Administration of Justice Act, was quickly nicknamed the Murder Act.
A very telling name. This act allowed any royal official, say a customs agent or a soldier who was accused of a crime in the colonies, to be sent elsewhere for trial,
Back to Britain.
or to another loyal colony. The colonists believed this gave officials a free pass to commit crimes, even murder, knowing they'd face a sympathetic, distant jury. It was a license for impunity.
Now, crucially, the Americans added a fourth law to their list of intolerable acts. One that wasn't aimed at Boston at all, but at Canada.
The Quebec Act of 1774. And from London's perspective, this was just an act of pragmatic good governance. It granted religious freedom to the French Catholic population in Quebec.
A sensible policy to ensure Canadian loyalty.
Exactly. But for the fiercely Protestant New Englanders, this was horrifying. It tapped into centuries of deep-seated anti-Catholicism and fear.
And the colonial propagandists ran with it.
They absolutely did. They framed it as the British government not just tolerating, but actively establishing Catholicism on their border. And the act also expanded Quebec's territory southwards into land claimed by other colonies.
Creating this fear of an unholy alliance.
Precisely. The fear was they were bringing Canadians and savages upon the English colonies, hemming them in with a Catholic empire.
And this fear was translated into powerful visual propaganda, like Paul Revere's cartoon, The Mitre Minuet.
That cartoon is a perfect summary of their fears. It shows Church of England bishops dancing with French Catholic bishops, a sinister conspiracy to destroy Protestant freedom. So the Quebec Act, while a strategic success for Britain and Canada, was a political disaster in the 13 colonies. It unified them against what they now saw as a total, comprehensive attack on their way of life.
And that unified response came in the form of the First Continental Congress.
Yes, London's strategy to isolate Massachusetts failed completely. Instead, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia in September 1774.
Only Georgia stayed away.
Georgia was the newest, smallest, and most dependent on the crown for defense, so they were hesitant. But for the others, the goal was to coordinate a unified response. Not independence yet, but a clear articulation of their rights and grievances.
And the key moment of that Congress, the one that really signaled a move toward militarization, was the adoption of the Suffolk Resolves.
Yes, these resolutions came from Suffolk County, Massachusetts, Boston's county. They were the most radical statements the Congress adopted. They declared the intolerable acts unconstitutional and void.
They urged a continuation of the boycott.
And most importantly, they explicitly urged the colonists to begin stockpiling weapons and organizing their militias for defense.
That's an undeniable preparation for war.
It is.
Yeah.
John Adams called it one of the happiest days of my life because it meant the continent was now formally behind Massachusetts and committed to military preparation. They were already contacting traders in Holland and Spain for weapons.
Yet London still seemed to believe this was a New England problem.
A catastrophic misjudgment. In February 1775, Parliament declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. They ordered General Thomas Gage, the governor and military commander, to restore order.
And his first move was to seize those rebel weapons stockpiles.
Specifically, the ones reported to be in the town of Concord.
Which leads directly to Lexington and Concord, April 1775.
Gage sent his troops out from Boston at night. But the alarm system, with Paul Revere and others, was incredibly effective. The whole countryside knew they were coming.
And that first confrontation on Lexington Green, it was chaotic.
Very confusing. The research suggests that neither side really wanted to be the one to fire first. The colonial militia had been ordered not to, but the British officers were incredibly nervous. They were worried about being shot in the back as they marched past.
So tactical anxiety led to the first shot.
It seems so. In the confusion, a shot was fired. We still don't know by whom. And once that happened, the nervous British regulars unleashed a volley. Several militiamen were killed.
The British then moved on to Concord, destroyed some supplies, but their march back to Boston became a nightmare.
A deadly 18-mile gauntlet. Militiamen from all over the region converged on the road, firing on the column from behind stone walls, trees, houses.
This was the guerrilla threat they feared.
And it was real. By the end of the day, the British had suffered significant casualties. They made it back to Boston, but they were now effectively trapped, besieged in the city by a countryside that had risen up in arms against them. The war had begun.
After that bloodshed, the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, and even then, they were still talking about loyalty to the king.
You were. They even sent one last petition, the Olive Branch Petition. But the military reality on the ground in Boston forced their hand. They had to create a continental army to command the thousands of militias now surrounding the city.
And the first, most crucial decision was appointing a commander-in-chief. The choice of George Washington was highly strategic.
It was a brilliant political move. Of course, Washington had the military experience in the 7 Years' War, and he had a powerful, commanding presence. But the real key was that he was from Virginia.
To balance out the influence of New England.
Exactly. John Adams, from Massachusetts, actually nominated Washington over his fellow New Englander, John Hancock. He knew that if the commander was another Massachusetts man, the other colonies might see it as Boston's private war.
So choosing a wealthy Southern planter made it a continental struggle.
It instantly solidified the cause and gave it the regional balance it desperately needed.
Now, on the British side, they were facing incredible logistical problems from the very start.
A complete nightmare. They had to fight a war across 3,000 miles of ocean. Their supply chain was managed by 4 different competing departments in London.
And the 2-month delay in communication
Meant that London was always issuing orders based on outdated intelligence. Orders that were often totally irrelevant by the time they arrived.
Yeah.
And they couldn't live off the land. They couldn't just take food from the farmers.
That would just create more rebels.
Right. So everything, food for the men, fodder for the horses, weapons, uniforms, it all had to be shipped across the Atlantic. It was logistically crippling.
And their commanders on the ground quickly realized this wasn't going to be a conventional European war.
Immediately, they saw the terrain was full of wood swamps, stone walls, and other enclosures. They knew the rebels could turn every tree and bush into a temporary fortress and fire with deliberation, coolness, and certainty before just melting away.
And they saw just how costly that could be at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775.
Bunker Hill was a shock to the British system. They took the hill, they won the battle tactically, but they suffered over 1,000 casualties, about a third of their attacking force. It was an unsustainable victory. It proved they couldn't afford to win many more battles like that.
And you see the culture clash and the complaints from British soldiers who called the Americans an ungenerous an enemy.
That phrase says so much. In European warfare, sniping from behind a wall was seen as dishonorable. The Americans refused to play by those rules, and the British found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't pin down and couldn't decisively beat.
But at the same time, there was this sense of imperial restraint. The British didn't use the kind of extreme brutality in America that they used in, say, Ireland or India.
That's a critical point. They chose not to adopt the harsh, scorched earth policies they used elsewhere, and that restraint came from the persistent feeling that the colonists were not foreign enemies. They were kith and kin, they were Protestants, they were of English stock.
So that cultural affinity acted as a kind of political brake on the war effort.
It did. There was huge opposition in London to treating Americans like Irish rebels. Had George III truly been the tyrant the propaganda claimed, he might have won the war much more quickly through sheer brutality. But that was a line they were unwilling to cross.
The war escalated further, though, when the British started looking for other ways to win, to exploit vulnerabilities. Which brings us to the South and slavery.
Yes. In November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation that completely changed the game in the South.
What did it promise?
Dunmore saw that the slaveholding colonies were sitting on a powder keg. His proclamation offered freedom to any enslaved person belonging to a patriot master who was willing to escape and join the British Army.
The goal was to create internal chaos and bolster his own forces.
Exactly. And there's a strong historical argument that this single act did more than almost anything else, more than common sense, maybe even more than the Declaration of Independence, to push white Virginians toward independence.
Because it threatened the very foundation of their society.
The specter of a mass slave uprising, organized and armed by the British, was their worst nightmare. Revolutionary leaders like James Madison were utterly appalled.
Yeah.
They saw this as an act of desperation, of barbarism, that justified a complete break.
And it also, of course, highlighted the massive hypocrisy at the heart of the Patriot cause.
A hypocrisy the British were more than happy to point out. The most famous critique came from Dr. Samuel Johnson in London. In 1775, he wrote a pamphlet where he asked, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?"
A devastating question.
So potent that Johnson was reportedly burned in effigy in Boston. It cut right to the core contradiction of their position.
But a thinker like Edmund Burke saw a different connection.
He did. Burke argued that Americans were so proud and jealous of their freedom precisely because they owned slaves. They lived daily with the reality of total subjugation, which made them acutely sensitive to any infringement, however small, on their own liberties.
So Dunmore's proclamation signaled that this was no longer a constitutional debate about taxes.
No. It was now an existential struggle, especially for the Southern elites. They were forced to choose between loyalty to the crown and the defense of their entire social and economic order, which was built on owning other human beings.
So by the end of 1775, the lines are drawn. A cycle is complete. Principled resistance leads to property destruction.
Which leads to London's punitive acts. That retaliation forces the colonies to unite and arm themselves, leading to the first shots of the war.
And that war, for many, becomes a war to defend American liberty, which is now inextricably tied to the defense of property, including enslaved property.
And that fundamental miscalculation in London, the belief they could reassert authority by punishing and isolating one colony, it backfired completely. It forced a continent of reluctant, property-owning colonists to unite for war. The question for you to consider is, once that line was crossed at Lexington in 1775, and once the defense of the Southern social order became part of the cause of liberty, was there truly any path left for reconciliation?
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.